Brazil is known as a UFO hotspot and has some of the most bizarre, terrifying, and mystifying UFO encounters in the world. Local folklore tells of blazing fireballs in the sky and even associates those fireballs with the discovery of gold, if you dare to follow them through the treacherous jungles. Brazil's UFO history is rich and goes back centuries, and some events continue to defy explanation to this day. Jose Higgins Incident. Many UFO reports are discredited because the witnesses are deemed to lack a formal education or professional training. Sometimes, though, the witnesses are much harder to simply hand-wave away, even if they're telling a pretty extraordinary story. Jose Higgins was a Brazilian topographer who on July 23, 1947, was carrying out some survey work along with a few colleagues in a field in Colônia Goiabang. Suddenly, the group heard a high-pitched sound directly overhead, prompting them to look up. To their amazement, a large disc-like object appeared approximately 30 meters in diameter, hovering over their heads, and landed near the stunned group of men. The object was grayish-white and landed on curved metal feet. Higgins' colleagues fled the scene in terror, but a sense of curiosity overrode Higgins' fear. He held his ground, and as the craft appeared to power down, he approached it. As he came closer, he spotted what looked like a window through which he could see two humanoid figures. A few moments later, a door opened on the craft, and two figures approximately 7 feet tall exited. The creatures were humanoid in shape with transparent overalls that covered their entire bodies, including their heads. This spacesuit seemed to be inflated with air, and the aliens wore metal backpacks on their backs. Underneath the transparent suit, the aliens appeared to be wearing clothing of very intense color, but not too dissimilar from human clothing. Their bodies were extremely thin, and their legs very long compared to a human. The beings had large heads with large eyes, but no visible hair of any kind. The beings communicated in an unknown, sonorous language that reminded Higgins of a song. Despite their very tall size, the beings moved very quickly, with Higgins later remarking to the grace and agility of the creatures. They formed a triangle with him at the center, and one of the creatures now holding a metal tube that pointed at Higgins, gesturing toward the inside of the UFO. Higgins approached the door to the UFO and looked inside. He seemed to be looking at what we might consider an airlock, a small cubicle with another interior door. Without entering, Higgins asked the creatures where they were taking him, trying to get his point across with gestures. The alien seemed to understand what he was trying to say, and the alien that Higgins assumed to be in charge bent down into the dirt and drew a round point surrounded by 7 circles. The alien then pointed at the 7th circle and pointed at the UFO. The implication was clear: the aliens were going to take Higgins with them to wherever they hailed from. Higgins, however, was not keen on becoming humanity's ambassador to an unknown alien world, and rather than running, believing the beings would overpower him, he tried to reason with them. He took out his wallet, showed them a picture of his wife, trying to indicate that he wanted to look for her first. The aliens appeared to relent and changed their interest from Higgins to the surroundings, with Higgins claiming that the aliens would pick and toss stones of huge size with ease. To him, they appeared to be playing much like children. The entire encounter lasted half an hour, until finally the aliens got back on their ship and took off, heading north and disappearing into the clouds. Higgins' story is incredible and difficult to authenticate, given the only sources are now 80 years old. It's unknown who Higgins' colleagues were or if they ever verified his story. However, Higgins did take his story to national newspapers, begging the question of why he would risk his professional reputation over a hoax. On our official Infographics UFO credibility scale, we give this one 3 Roswells out of 10, given the lack of any supporting evidence. Barra de Tijuca photographs. Higgins might not have had any proof of his encounter, but this following case would produce some of the best photographic proof of the UFO phenomenon. This incident would even spark the interest of the Central Intelligence Agency, which would describe it in an internal memo. On May 7, 1952, reporter João Martins and photographer Ed Keffel were on a routine assignment in Barra de Tijuca. At about 4:30 p.m., Martins spotted an object in the air approaching them at very high speed. At first, he believed it was an airplane, and from a head-on angle it did look like one. But as it got closer, they realized it was flying sideways. Keffel managed to photograph the object multiple times before it faded from view. The two turned in their photos to the publication, but received no bonus or financial compensation. In fact, as their photographs became national and then international news, they made it a point to ensure they never received any compensation for the photos in order to avoid suspicion of hoaxing. The Brazilian Air Force took a keen interest in the photos, with some skeptics doubting whether they were authentic, claiming that the shadows in the foliage in one of the photos were irregular. However, upon the team going to the exact place the encounter took place and taking their own photographs at the same time as the men did, they determined the photos were genuine. That hasn't stopped skeptics from pointing out what they see as inconsistent shadows in photograph number 4, where it appears as if the object is being lit from the left while the foliage is lit from the right. It is possible, however, that local geography blocked the light from the sun toward the left of the frame, causing shadows to appear on the left of the vegetation while the sun was shining from the same direction. The one tree which stands tall and alone in the image seems to have the right shadows which match those on the object. It also seems like a significant but not impossible error for an experienced photographer to make if creating a hoax. The Brazilian Air Force, however, was convinced the photos were real when their team went to the same location at the same time of day and took their own test photographs. So in the end, we have a choice between the word of an on-the-scene investigation by a government team and skeptics who drew their conclusions from a photograph without physically visiting the site. With the on-the-ground investigation authenticating the photographs, we're giving this case 7 Roswells out of 10 for authenticity. Fort Itaipu UFO attack. Sufficient incidents/accidents have been accurately reported and medical data acquired as to support a hypothesis that some advanced electromagnetic weapon systems are already deployed and opaque to full U.S. understanding. So reads a line from a declassified 2010 Defense Intelligence reference document detailing an investigation into alleged attacks by UFOs on personnel. The document in question investigated a claim that 3 men were exposed to an energy beam from a UFO. This is not the only time UFOs reportedly attacked people, with one of the first alleged attacks on humans by a UFO occurring in 1957. At the time, there was a wave of UFO sightings in the country, and disturbingly, some witnesses were coming forward with strange burns that they claimed they received from the UFOs in question. One incident that made the Brazilian government take the phenomenon seriously, however, occurred at 2 a.m. in early November of that year. At that time, 2 sentries on duty at Fort Itaipu witnessed a luminous orange disk coming toward them from out at sea. The object was moving alarmingly fast and very close to the waves and quickly closed the distance to the guards. Suddenly, the disk stopped right over them. The guards felt a wave of heat and their skin felt as if it had burst into flame. The men began screaming and running away, prompting soldiers to come rushing out of their barracks. Many of the soldiers arrived just in time to spot the glowing UFO rapidly moving away. The attack caused the fort's electrical system to fail and left the soldiers with first and second degree burns over 10% of their bodies. An investigation discovered that other similar incidents occurred as far away as the US in the same time frame. Earlier that day, several cars were stranded on a highway near Oro Grande, New Mexico, when an egg-shaped object flew by overhead. A witness who had left their vehicle to take a closer look suffered a severe sunburn. 2 days later, another UFO in Merrim, Indiana, bathed a farmer's land in light, causing serious burns to Renee Gillam's face, leading to him having to spend 2 days in the hospital. Then, on November 10th, at 1:30 a.m. in Madison, Ohio, a woman saw an acorn-shaped UFO hovering just behind her garage. She watched it floating noiselessly for half an hour, and in the week to come developed a body rash and had vision problems, which prompted her doctor to believe she'd suffered radiation poisoning. The Fort Itaipu attack would be investigated by the Brazilian military, which could not explain the men's condition. However, the results of the full investigation were never released to the public. We have recently created weapons of our own which perfectly mirror the effects suffered by the Brazilian sentries. Microwave crowd dispersal weapons which can create a heating effect on the skin so intense it prompts anyone afflicted to flee the area. However, these weapons have not been shown to cause the actual burning effect suffered, though it may simply be a matter of wattage. We may not know what truly happened that night, but before passing judgment, we should consider this line from the same Defense Intelligence reference document investigating the effects of EM attacks on humans by alleged anomalous aerospace phenomenon. The pattern and circumstances of injury very often belie naysayer attempts to discredit the witnesses, analysts, and those who suffer directly or indirectly from the systems. Without knowing the full results of the official investigation, we're going to give this one 5 Roswells out of 10 for credibility. While UFOs causing burns to people is well documented in eyewitness testimony, and the US government has expressed an interest in the phenomenon, this particular case remains very difficult to verify without actual witness testimony and hard data. The truck driver abduction. The Elias Seixas UFO incident will become one of Brazil's best-known cases, and one that left behind significant medical evidence of its own. On September 21, 1980, Elias Seixas and his cousin, Alberto Seixas Vieira, and a friend, Guaraci de Souza, were driving a truck back from a nearby town. The truck began to experience strange electrical phenomenon, after which the men were hit by a wave of drowsiness. Suddenly, Elias felt a pressure on his neck and the lights on the truck began to turn on and off. He pulled over and got out of the truck, feeling as if a voice was speaking to him inside of his head. Elias didn't remember what happened next, but his cousin and friend both claimed that Elias was suddenly hit by a beam of blue light. Once they were all out of the truck, though, there was no sign of the beam of light, except for what they thought was a forest fire about a mile away. The men decided to investigate, but when it was clear that it wasn't a fire but rather an object of some kind, the men turned back and headed for the truck. Climbing back in, they started the truck up and took off. At some point, though, Guaraci's hat was blown off his head and went out the window. They stopped the truck to retrieve the hat, and then the men were hit with a severe bout of sleepiness once again. The next thing they remembered was being on the road to a nearby town, but something more had happened before they found themselves back inside the truck driving down the highway. Elias would seek out regressive hypnosis to help him put pieces of that evening back together. That's when he would break through the mental fog and remember being hit by a very strong light which took him inside a ship of some kind. Once inside, Elias saw an alien being sitting on a seat watching him. His memory remained broken, but he remembered being laid on a kind of bed while one of his friends struggled with one of the aliens, even punching him. The beings then placed some kind of device in his skull and chest, collecting blood and sperm and making small punctures on his fingers. Elias then says he was taken to view what his alien captors explained was one of their bases on Mars. There, Elias saw several beings with large heads much bigger than their tiny bodies. Taken through this facility, Elias also saw two men, one black and one white, who were joined at the arm like Siamese twins. Elias attempted to touch the men, but he wasn't allowed to, instead being moved along. He was shown another alien species, which to him seemed like gray plastic dolls, before being returned to Earth. Elias's story is 9.5 Gary Buseys on the Gary Busey Crazy Index, which is why it's good for him that he's got some compelling medical evidence. Upon returning home, he apparently was unable to recognize his own daughter and suffered impotence for 4 months. Doctors were unable to explain his sudden sexual dysfunction, but what was truly anomalous was the mark left on his chest and calcification discovered on his skull, which experts stated could only happen if he'd undergone surgery of some sort. His wife would also attest to the disappearance of a cyst on his hand that had been there for years. If Elias was hoaxing, he stuck to his story his entire life, and so did his cousin and their friend. We're giving this one 5 Roswells of credibility out of 10, if only because we failed to find any other supporting information gathered by a Brazilian UFO investigation group. Without access to the doctor's statements and other evidence, this remains an interesting story and nothing more. The Night of the UFOs. May 19, 1986 would be the day Brazil was invaded by UFOs, prompting national media to dub it the Night of the UFOs. This event, though, would be verified by multiple radar contacts and thousands of witnesses across 4 Brazilian states, including military pilots sent to intercept the unknown craft. The invasion of Brazil started at 8:15 p.m. when an air traffic controller at São José dos Campos Airport spotted 3 bright lights hovering over the airport. Too close for their own radar, ATC contacted Guarulhos International Airport, which confirmed radar contacts on 3 objects near the São José dos Campos Airport. The air traffic controller at São José dos Campos observed the objects through binoculars, noticing that they emitted a bright red light but rapidly changed colors to yellow, green, and orangish. They dimmed the runway lights and noticed the objects drew closer. When they increased the lights again, the UFOs backed off. An hour later, an incoming plane reported 3 bright red lights near the airport, which were now moving from east to west. The aircraft was being flown by Colonel Osiris Silva, founder of Brazilian International Aerospace Consortium Embraer. Silva noted that the objects appeared like big red stars, and he turned his aircraft to draw nearer, but they kept their distance. At 9:39 p.m., Santa Cruz Air Force Base was put on high alert due to several unidentified radar plots around the nearby airport. A half hour later, another nearby Air Force Base went on alert after picking up more unidentified radar contacts. At 10:27 p.m., an F-5E fighter was scrambled from Santa Cruz Air Force Base and put on course to intercept the lights. The pilot reported detecting one object on radar and approaching until he made visual contact with a white light flying below him. The light then began to climb, maintaining a steady distance of around 10 to 12 miles between itself and the F-5. Despite the pilot's best attempts, he could never close the distance between himself and the object, almost as if it was taunting him. He followed the light, which alternated from white to red, green, and then white again, out to sea until he was forced to turn back due to low fuel. At 10:48, a Mirage 2000 interceptor detected 5 UFOs over radar but never made visual contact. It did track one of those contacts, getting to within 2 miles, but was unable to get a visual. Watching it on his radar, the pilot observed the craft make several zigzagging turns and even 90-degree banks before finally speeding away at an estimated Mach 15. At 10:50, a second F-5 took off and reported visual and radar contact with an object emitting a bright red light. The pilot put the pedal to the metal in an attempt to catch up with the object when it suddenly dimmed and its radar plot disappeared, as if it had simply ceased to exist. As the pilot turned around to return to base, ground-based radar detected 13 individual radar plots directly behind the F-5. The pilot made a sudden turn but was unable to make either a visual or radar contact of his own. 4 days after 21 total radar plots were detected above the Brazilian skies, the Minister of the Air Force made a public statement on the incident. He confirmed everything that had happened and stated, "It's not about believing or not in aliens. We can only give out technical information. There are several hypotheses. Technically, I tell you, gentlemen, that we have no explanation." The official Brazilian military investigation would remain classified until 2009. The declassified document verified the events of that infamous evening and made the following notes on the behavior of the objects. The objects could vary their velocities from subsonic to supersonic, as well as hover. They could vary their altitudes from below 5,000 to above 40,000 feet, emitted white, green, and red light, or emitted no light at all. Objects were capable of sudden acceleration or deceleration, were capable of turning with constant radiuses or conducting sharp 90-degree turns, showed intelligence in their capability to maintain distance from observers as well as flying in formation, though not necessarily crewed. Given the plethora of hard evidence in the form of radar tracks from multiple different radars and testimony from both the ground witnesses and fighter pilots, the night of the UFOs remains one of the most credible UFO events in Brazilian history, if not the entire world. We're giving this one a solid 10 out of 10 Roswells for credibility. Something which defies human understanding happened that infamous night over the skies in Brazil, and given recent revelations and an official Pentagon investigation into the phenomenon, it might seem we are not alone in this universe. Now abduct and probe your boredom with declassified Soviet Union UFO encounters, or click this other video instead.